Chapter 9. The Search for the Soul. Jen stepped up across from Nate. She was struck, not for the first time, by just how conventionally attractive he was. His hair was swept back haphazardly, his eyes gleamed bright blue, and his teeth gleamed bright white. His muscular arms were perfectly tanned. He even had a superhero figure, complete with barrel chest and a small waist. Yet Jen was immediately turned off by the guy in every other conceivable way. As attractive as his body was, his attitude was equally unattractive. Nate was strong, and Nate was hot, and Nate knew it. And everyone who looked at Nate knew that Nate knew it. This wasn't like Lawrence, for example. Lawrence had a lot of pride in his abilities, whereas Nate radiated something more along the lines of pure, unadulterated narcissism. Jen knew before he even spoke that he was going to be completely insufferable. "Hey, gorgeous," Nate told Jen as soon as Jen's feet touched the mat, confirming her suspicions. "You my opponent?" His voice reminded Jen of that kind of douchey-sounding actor, Matthew something. "Yeah," Jen replied with a frown. Nate looked Jen up and down, very deliberately, and shot her a condescending smile. "That's nice," he said, "but maybe you should rethink that. I'm the strongest guy who trains here, except maybe for Rocky. I don't want to hurt you by accident. How about instead of fighting, you forfeit the match, and in exchange, old Nate'll take you out sometime." "Over my dead body," Jen growled. "Don't worry," Nate replied, his smile visibly souring as energy began to crackle between himself and his opponent. "I should be able to hold back a little more than that." "All right, everyone," Jack said from a distant corner of the room as the last of the first group of fighters reached their starting positions. "Let's keep it clean, but most importantly, let the hearts begin." Jen slipped immediately into a ready stance, just as Nate sent his soul out into the area charged by his and Jen's mingling energies. His energy surrounded Jen and split into 7 columns that flattened out into thin, sheer sheets of light. Out of the corner of her eye, Jen could see her companions, save for Sarah, who was busy fighting, watching her with interest. More of interest to her, though, was that Rocky was watching her as well. Jen turned her full attention back toward Nate, who stood behind one of the sheets of energy, beaming at her through it. "Come on, sweetie," he said. "Let's see what you've got." Nate spread his arms wide, and his image flickered onto the surface of each of the energy sheets, like reflections upon a set of mirrors. Each of them followed his movements exactly in real time. Jen had never seen a technique like this. It wasn't like Karen's illusions, which were fully three-dimensional and realistic. These images wouldn't serve as decoys, and even Nate had to know that, as simple-minded as he seemed to be. The technique had to have another purpose, so Jen set to work quickly, probing it, searching for what that might be. She held her hands out to her sides and traced simple sigils in the air with each. 2 orbs of soft purple soul sprang into existence, and she snatched them up, tossing them one after another at Nate. She put a spin on them, setting them on a curve that would take them around the sheet of energy between her and her opponent. Once they were past, Jen would send her energy out and will them to curve further, striking both Nate and the ground beneath him, yanking him down off his feet and tethering him in place. Seeing that his technique boxed her in and put a surface between herself and her opponent, Jen's first thought was that it was a defensive construct, so she didn't expect her blasts to reach their target, and she was curious to see why they wouldn't. She got her answer when, just before the 2 orbs could pass the sheet of energy, Nate motioned with one hand. His image disappeared from the 7 sheets, and they rotated around the centralmost point between them. Jen's attacks struck 2 of the energy sheets and were absorbed into them. It seemed for just a moment that that was their function, to disperse the energy of any soul-based attacks that hit them harmlessly along their 7 surfaces. But that hypothesis was proven incorrect a moment later when the 2 orbs re-emerged again from 2 of the other energy sheets, their paths diverted toward Jen at the center. Jen jumped up, twisting in the air, avoiding her own attacks by the skin of her teeth. They spiraled out of the air, hit the ground, and dispersed. Meanwhile, the sheets of energy stopped rotating, one of them settling back into place directly between Nate and his opponent. His image flashed again upon them. "They don't just disperse soul attacks," Jen reasoned. "They also transfer those attacks to a different random surface and send them back." Something that interacted in such a way with soul wasn't likely to have any special effect on physical objects, though. Even if the sheets were solid, and they likely were, Jen should be able to force her way through them. She willed her energies to mix, generating a huge burst of soul that she directed into her legs, boosting her speed. At the same moment, she wrapped herself in soft purple soul, lowering her own personal gravity and making her even faster. She launched herself forward so fast that even the well-trained eyes of the fighters in the room had trouble tracking her, reaching the sheet of energy between herself and her opponent in less time than it would have taken him to blink. Her fist held high, prepared to strike should she succeed and bypass the barrier, Jen willed the energy surrounding her to shift. Suddenly, as she turned shoulder first toward the glowing surface, her weight became normal. She expected to shatter the barrier and shoulder her way right through it, but instead, the moment she touched the barrier, something altogether unexpected happened. Rather than pass through the energy sheet, Jen felt as if she was being folded up. She passed into the barrier like a portal, emerging again from one of the other surfaces, ending up right back where she'd started. Momentarily disoriented by her sudden translocation, she was caught unaware when Nate motioned again, rotating the 7 sheets of energy for a second time. He gestured, the sheet of energy closest to him rotating in place 180 degrees, and he jumped into it. Like Jen, he passed into that sheet, emerging from another one inside the circle, right in Jen's blind spot. He threw a kick at her abdomen, knocking her back toward the ring of barriers. Once again, she passed into one of them and emerged from another, directly in the path of Nate's backhanding fist. Jen reacted more quickly than she thought possible, leaning so far to the side that she had to brace herself against the ground with her hand, but she managed to slip beneath Nate's strike. She righted herself and lunged at him, meaning to drive her knee into his gut, but he gestured again, and the sheet of energy nearest to him spun around. He stepped into it, emerging back outside the circle. With another gesture, the 7 sheets of energy spun rapidly, slowing and settling back into their original orientations. They shimmered as they switched places randomly. Jen and her opponent were right back where they had started, both figuratively and literally, and Jen was the only one who was any weaker for it. The difference this time was that Jen had already seen what Nate's technique could do. With all of that shuffling and spinning, she couldn't begin to map which sheets connected with each other, and it was possible that there were ways to use them other than what Jen had seen. But seeing as how Nate's use of the technique was completely reactionary, a plan was already bouncing around in Jen's head. Jen had to admit that Nate's technique, which literally allowed him to fold space semi-freely, was impressive, but he had built his entire fighting style around it, and that was his weakness. She turned in place in what would look to anyone else to be an erratic pattern, looking in desperation from one of the sheets of energy to the next. She appeared as if she felt trapped, so much so that several of the competitors who were watching her match, including Rocky, lost interest. Monty and Lawrence also turned their attention elsewhere, assessing Mina and Ray as they had promised they would. It was a shame. Jen had wanted Rocky to see her full array of abilities. The thought of seeing his reaction had interested her. Now she was going to miss out. After turning in place a few more times, stepping erratically around the space within Nate's circle, Jen stopped abruptly and turned on her heel to face Nate once again. He was standing behind one of his energy sheets, grinning at her, his arms crossed triumphantly. Jen uttered a low growl at her opponent, and she charged at him. Just like before, the moment she came into contact with the sheet of energy that separated them, she passed into it and emerged again in the center of the circle. Also, just like before, Nate gestured. The sheets of energy rotated around Jen, one of them spun in place, and Nate passed into it and appeared with Jen in the center. He came at her from a different direction this time, throwing a punch at her jaw. Jen ducked out of the way of his attack, only for him to follow it up immediately with a knee to her face. She brought her hands up to defend, absorbing the majority of the force of the blow, but she was still knocked back. She stumbled, stopping herself just short of falling into one of the energy sheets again, but Nate surged forward, meaning to press his advantage. He thought that he'd pushed Jen to her limits, that he'd made her desperate, and was now, at most, a few more hits away from victory. But he was wrong. The moment his feet touched the ground within his own circle, a different circle lit up with purple light just beneath him. While Jen was turning in place and acting frantic, she'd used her movements to disguise the drawing of one of her complex floor sigils. It sprang immediately to full size, extending beyond the rings of energy sheets completely. Before Nate even realized what was happening, he was caught within the incredible force of the sigil's gravity. He fell heavily to the floor, unable to move. Meanwhile, the moment the sigil sprang into existence, Jen wrapped herself in just enough of her soft purple soul to counter the sigil's effects on her almost completely. Nate was down, but Jen was free to move about as normal. For a few moments, Jen wondered how the match would be decided. No one had ever said anything about who would be judging the fights. That's when Jack rushed over from where he'd been standing in the corner of the room and confirmed that Nate was down. He counted to 10 while Nate simply lay there, frowning and defeated, with Jen standing over him, mirroring his triumphant look from before. The energy charging the air around the two fighters faded away, and both Nate and Jen's techniques faded into the ether. Nate stood up slowly and worked the kinks out of his joints. His interest in Jen seemed to have waned considerably, which only made her happier. Chris sauntered over to stand by her sister's side. She didn't fight until the second group, and she had actually paid attention to Jen's entire fight. "What did you think?" Jen asked her sister. "It was kind of boring," Chris replied simply. "That cute guy was never going to win against someone like you. Same for the guy Sarah's fighting." She turned toward where Sarah's fight was still going on. Sarah's opponent, a guy who was even taller than Tucker, had been caught within the grip of Sarah's soul-infused ice. Sarah stood beside him and waited, picking her nails, looking profoundly bored. He struggled, but it wasn't long before he announced his surrender, bringing the first group of heart-to-hearts to an end. A quick look around told Jen that Mina and Ray had both won their matches as well. That meant that Jen would fight Ray in the next round, and Sarah would fight Mina. Assuming that Jen and Sarah both managed to win again, they would fight each other in round 3. Jen couldn't help but smile at the thought. "All right," Jack declared excitedly, stepping into the center of the room. "The first group is finished, which means it's the second group's turn to fight. Everyone ready?" The second group paired up. One of the pairings was made up entirely of people who Jen didn't know, but each of the other 3 was of interest to her. Chris was fighting one of Jack's students, and Monty and Lawrence were fighting each other. But most interesting to Jen was Tucker's opponent. Rocky was someone who Jen was very eager to see in action. She reached up and removed the ring necklace from around her neck. It hadn't glowed during her fight with Nate, but Jen had never expected it to in the first place. Not really. She walked over to Tucker and handed the necklace off to him. He slipped it on as he stepped up to face his opponent. Tucker seemed just as eager to see what Rocky could do as Jen was, which was a very good sign. Jen smiled. She was a little bummed that she wouldn't get to fight Rocky herself, but if anyone here could draw out the full strength of another powerful fighter, it was Tucker. Energy crackled between Tucker and his opponent, filling the air with an intense static charge. Jack announced the start of the matches, but Tucker and Rocky didn't move right away, taking a few moments to size each other up. Tucker stepped into his wild, all-or-nothing stance, while Rocky did almost the exact opposite. His stance was square and sturdy, and so solid that it looked like a bulldozer would have trouble knocking him down. Tucker, being Tucker, he didn't care how difficult it would be to move his opponent. He willed his energies to mix, kicking his aura into full power just long enough to turn it away from himself, launching himself forward like a rocket. He forced the rest of his available soul into his arm, strengthening his offensive power as much as possible without keeping his aura active and wearing himself down. He wound up to punch, aiming for Rocky's jaw, but his attack never stood a chance of connecting. Rocky shifted his stance, sliding his feet in wide circles, keeping his footing as solid as possible, and he set his shoulders in line with Tucker's strike. His energies mixed as he braced himself, catching Tucker's fist in one hand with visible effort. Immediately, Rocky shifted his stance again, pulling Tucker off balance and exposing his torso. He struck twice with his palm, hitting Tucker solidly in his chest and his ribs. The force of the 2 strikes sent Tucker sliding back across the length of the mat. He dug his heels into the ground and skidded to a stop, almost exactly where he'd started. Tucker smiled across at his opponent. He hadn't been hit that hard since his fight with Lawrence. The prospect of fighting someone else that strong got him fired up, figuratively, thankfully. Before he could voice that to his opponent, though, he was momentarily distracted by a red glow emanating from the neighborhood of his chest. He looked down at the silver ring hanging there. Its stone continued to glow for another few seconds before going dark again. "What is that?" Rocky asked him, sounding curious rather than wary. "That," Tucker replied, "is something telling me that me and my friends are going to want to talk to you later. But that's all. It doesn't mean anything to the fight that we're having right now. In fact," he removed the ring from his neck and tossed it behind him, where Jen snatched it deftly out of the air. "Hang on to that. I won't be needing it anymore." Jen smiled. "Be careful, Tuck." "Never gonna happen," Tucker replied. He willed his energies to mix again, and his fiery red aura wrapped him up in its chaotic light. He clenched his fists, and they were wreathed in flames. Without another moment of hesitation, he launched himself forward once again, trailing his aura behind him like a pair of flaming wings, renewing his all-out assault. At the other end of the mat, Rocky didn't even move, standing firm and waiting for Tucker's attack.